Hello guys and gals, and welcome to another episode of Path of Exile Skills. Today we're going to be taking a look at a spell. I built an entire character around this ability because I thought it was kind of fun, and it's called Bone Cage. Bone Cage is a spell that is an AoE physical duration Nova, and it is also repeatable. It's kind of an interesting ability, and I'll show you how I have it set up in a minute. Raise a ring of bone spikes around you. The spikes are destroyed when enemies touch them, damaging and pinning those enemies. Raising a new ring of spikes destroys the previous one. Certain skills and effects allow the damage to build up to be pinned. Once this build-up passes the enemy's pin threshold, they are pinned, preventing them from moving, being moved, or evading for 3 seconds. They are also light-stunned when they become pinned. Pinned targets also count as immobilization, which is pretty interesting. It deals a pretty large amount of physical damage, so 1,613 to 2,419 physical. As you can see, pins as though dealing 50% more damage than normal. Cage radius is 1.8 meters, explosion radius is 1 meter, and cage duration is 1.6. The additional effect on this is pinned enemies as though dealing 50% more damage. So you're basically pinning enemies as though dealing 100% more damage. And then, of course, we can look up the additional effect for the Gemling Legionnaire, which is 40% more magnitude of bleeding inflicted, which is kind of interesting. When you take a look at the ability and how it functions, I mean, it's a pretty simple ability. It makes a ring around you in a circle, and any monster that hits it explodes. It has multiple, obviously, effects in that ring, so you can get some crazy damage out of it because each individual pin is its own explosion. And on top of that, you can also set it up to have a larger radius. You can have it set up to have larger explosion radius and so forth and so on. I'm currently setting up for like crit on this particular one, so I'm doing crit damage. And I'm not really worried about anything other than physical damage, so I'm also utilizing Spell Echo to get more of them, and I'm also using them to break armor, so I'm specifically using them to break armor with this particular character. It's a pretty nice effect. The more you break armor, obviously, the better. I should be using Uruk's Smelting on this character. I don't know why I'm not using Uruk's Smelting. The Uruk's Smelting. I don't think I'm using the endurance charges, so why am I not using Uruk's Smelting? Am I using Uruk's Smelting somewhere else? I am not. So we should be using Uruk's. Uruk's is a really interesting one that allows you to get a permanent physical damage increase. And the permanent physical damage increase is actually really nice. Overall, just allowing you to deal 5% more damage to basically any target that you hit. As an armor breaking ability, it's pretty nice. Uruk's Smelting, yeah, there it is. So targets take 5% increased physical damage permanently, up to 20%.
I'll post it right
Let me see here. I'm using Armor Break 3. I think the reason why I'm not using it is because I didn't want to squeeze it in here. Yeah, I don't know if I want to squeeze it in. I think that's why I didn't have it. I wasn't. I was out of slots, basically, is what I'm thinking. So Bone Cage can be pretty cool as far as like Triscalon Cascade is concerned too. One of the newer abilities in the game, you can use Triscalon to get a large pattern of bone cages, which is really cool. It is technically a spell and not an attack, so there is some interesting bonuses that you can get with it. Like for instance, this really cool modifier here. 30% chance to impale on a spell hit, which basically allows you to apply impale damage with Bone Cage. Impale is a debuff that inflicted by hits, which stores 30% of pre-mitigation physical hit damage. Impaling hits as its magnitude, and then a subsequent attack causes the impale to basically deal damage to the target. I'm utilizing Repulsion for this because Repulsion technically counts as an attack. So when Repulsion Wave actually hits the target, it does actually pull that Impale and put it back on the target, which is really cool. There's also some really nice armor break ones that you can utilize with pinning if you happen to be down here on this side of the tree. There's a really nice one here, which is break 50% of armor on pinning an enemy. So as soon as you pin an enemy, you can get immediate, beautiful just 50% armor break, which is pretty cool. Overall, this character has been really fun to make, but let me show you how it works in practice so you can see how Bone Cage actually functions when you're attacking targets, right? So let's go kill some stuff. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that because of the way that Bone Cage works, I get a lot of micro explosions. Repulsion is also acting as a very interesting way to get additional explosions here, because the Bone Cage is, of course, hitting the target, applying the Impale, and then the Repulsion is then pulling the Impale, and it's also applying its own explosion, dishing out some pretty nice additional damage. The AoE on this is actually surprisingly good because of the way that the entire ability functions. Multiple explosions, multiple, obviously, bone cages, and of course, if I want even more AoE at any point, I can use Triscalon Cascade and get a very large explosion with Triscalon Cascade, which is going to just do way more damage to the group. I found that Bone Cage was just a really fun ability to design around. Not only does it do good single target damage, but it also does good AoE damage. It functions as a defensive mechanic because it appears around you in a circle, and any monster that runs towards you to try and attack you is obviously going to get hit by it. If you're a physical damage build, like for instance if you're running plants, or if you're running any of the physical damage spells, and you happen to be stacking physical damage, there's honestly no reason not to include Bone Cage in your repertoire, because it's just a really amazing ability that you can use either defensively or offensively at any time. In fact, I kind of went through like every single ability on the tree before I settled on Bone Cage, and I was rather surprised when I found out, just how good Bone Cage was, and I feel like a lot of people are sleeping on this ability. Let's go play with the boss with this particular ability. So we're going to start out, and we're going to go ahead and just start our rotation. Let's get a little bit further away to make sure that our Bone Cages are hitting the target at the right distance. And as you can clearly see, I'm ripping through this monster's HP with relative ease. And this isn't even really like a fully decked out, like crazy Bone Cage build. It's just something that I slapped together, and I didn't have any intention of like fully finishing it, right? But it doesn't really have any trouble killing just about anything in the game. I did notice that Bone Cage works very well with Spell Echo and Spell Cascade, both of them. Both Spell Echo and Spell Cascade are very good. The only problem is that Spell Cascade reduces the damage of it, and I didn't really particularly like that, although it is a very effective thing with Spell Echo. However, if you're utilizing Triscalon Cascade, you don't really need the Spell Echo anyway, because you can basically hit the entire screen anyway with Triscalon Cascade. In fact, most of the time you just find yourself right in the middle of the pack, and you go ahead and Triscalon Cascade, and everything can get annihilated fairly easy. Blasphemy with Repulsion is just absolutely amazing with this particular setup, because it allows you to pull, like I said, the Impales, but it also functions very similarly to the way that Bone Cage works, right? Bone Cage is almost kind of like an aura. It's a Nova skill, but auras are things that only happen to monsters that are directly around you in a specific radius. Well, if I want to use Bone Cage, then I got to be within range, unless you want to use the, I believe it's like a tele-use ability that allows you to cast a spell from further away. You can potentially do that with Bone Cage if you want to, but I don't know if I would. It just seems much more powerful this way, because you act as the bait in the center of the trap, and just makes it really powerful. Now, on top of the fact that Bone Cage is obviously a circular ability that hits like all around you in a circle, one thing you have to note is that like the size of the Bone Cage determines where the bones pop up. It's not necessarily kind of like a Nova ability where increasing the area of effect just simply increases the overall, like, radius that it hits. Bone Cage doesn't hit in a radius. It hits in a circle. Not in a, like, filled in circle either. Think about like somebody ate all the pizza out of the center of a pizza and left just the crust, right? The size of the pizza is going to determine where the bone cage comes up, and sometimes this can be a problem because, well, when you're fighting monsters, you can have the monster be in a place that is not accessible by the bone cage. Now, I did find that in general, increasing your area of effect is good because it also increases the area of effect of the explosion radius, right? So increasing the area of effect of the explosion radius is good because each one of the tines explodes, and then you can have multiple tines hitting the same target, which is actually kind of nice. But it does come as a double-edged sword because it also increases the radius of the cage, which also makes it kind of difficult for you to get the target directly where it needs to be. Having lots of explosions obviously helps, but when there is only a single target left, if the target is not in the right place and they're not getting hit by the cage, then that can be an issue. So you might want to like hold off on super scaling area of effects because it doesn't necessarily have as good of a positive bonus for the skill as you would think, simply because of the whole issue with the cage itself getting larger and smaller. And I can give you a practical example of this. So let's go back to town and I'll show you the difference between like magnified area and concentrated area, which concentrated area is pretty good too, but I also found that concentrated area kind of made the ability too small. It's kind of a sweet spot, right? You want a sweet spot of where the ability is supposed to go, and if it's not in that particular sweet spot, then things can go wrong. So let's take a look at different versions of Bone Cage. So let's pull out the armor break for the second. We're going to take a look at the Magnified Area 1, which is not even the biggest. But as you can see, the skill becomes much larger. There's much more of a gap in between you and where the bone cage is, so there's a larger area where the monsters can stand and they can beat on you. If we take a look at concentrated area is going to shrink that by a rather large margin. And you might notice that one of the bone cages seems to be appearing further away than the other bone cage, and that's because I'm utilizing Spell Echo. So Spell Echo does increase the area of effect of the second spell, which means that the second cast from the Echo is in a different place than the first cast, which is actually a good thing, and it's kind of what you're looking for. However, decreasing the size also decreases the size of the Triscalon Cascade. So the Triscalon Cascade becomes a much smaller Triscalon Cascade when you're utilizing concentrated area versus when you're utilizing, say, something like magnified area, which increases the overall size rather tremendously. As you can see, a much larger area with magnified area versus concentrated. So there's a lot of like interesting things going on with this ability on how you might potentially want to utilize it best. And it really comes down to, you know, like how large do you need it to be? Giggity. How small do you need it to be? Do you want the explosions to be large? Are you going to be in melee range? Are you not going to be in melee range? I believe the... let me double check here, but I believe there is a support gem that allows you to cast remotely. I can't remember what it's called right off the top of my head. Coursing current, control destruction, a new wild shards, zenith, rapid casting. I can't remember the name of that one that allows you to basically get like... Let me do a quick search and I'll see if I can find it. It says there's ones for the totem, but huh. Astral projection, I think that's what it's called. Supported skills cast at the target location instead of around you. So this one in particular could potentially allow you to take Bone Cage and turn it into a offensive ability that you can cast away from yourself, right? The only problem with this now is my Repulsion isn't going to be active when I'm casting the ability, but, you know, it still works. And I can, of course, cast the Triscalon Cascade. I believe that Triscalon Cascade, no matter what, still goes around you in a circle, because it does actually specifically state that it's going to be cascadable around you, focus on you as the center. Overall, just a really fun ability. Very high physical damage. Definitely you need to break armor with this ability in some way. You don't necessarily have to break it with Bone Cage. You can break it with other abilities. But you can also utilize this with the support gem Armor Explosion, although I don't necessarily recommend it if you're using it as your main ability. But if you're just using it to break armor with, there is a really nice one called Armor Explosion. Which I don't seem to have an Armor Explosion in here. Let me go ahead and grab a support gem for that, and I'll show you Armor Explosion. Armor Explosion is a level 1 support gem, and it basically makes it so that when you fully break an enemy's armor, it triggers an explosion. And the explosion does some pretty good fire damage. It's actually not bad at all. And if you're utilizing this as a armor break skill, essentially. The explosion cannot break armor, but the ability that you're using can't, obviously. And so you get to break the armor, and then you get to get an explosion for breaking the armor, which can lead into some pretty nice damage. I was using it on Bone Cage for a while until I started to focus primarily on damage output, and once you're focusing on damage output, you don't really need the Armor Explosion, because it already is an AoE skill and it already does very good damage. But Armor Explosion can definitely be something that you throw in there if you're just using your Bone Cage to break armor with, which it is good for that as well, as you can clearly see on what I was playing. I think that's pretty much it. I do enjoy using this skill. I built an entire character around it, obviously, and had a lot of fun with it. I tried out some of the other bone skills, and I wasn't really quite as impressed as I was with Bone Cage. And I, like I said before, I would definitely recommend that if you're utilizing some of the other physical damage spells, like for instance, maybe you are a, as an example, maybe you are an Entangle or a Thrashing Vines, or maybe you're utilizing Tornado. Or like some of the other physical damage spells. There's a lot of physical damage spells in the game, like in the Occult tree. There's a couple of physical ones like Bone Storm. There's also obviously Bone Cage, Unearth, and some of the others. These can definitely like synergize, right? So if you're already building physical, you're already building the physical stuff that you need to enhance Bone Cage. Bone Cage becomes more and more useful in those scenarios where you can simply just add it into one of your builds. So like if you are a plant character or you are a character running one of those other physical damage spells, I'd highly recommend checking out Bone Cage and seeing how you could potentially work it into your repertoire, because it's worth it. As always, I do appreciate you guys and gals watching. Be sure to hit that like button and subscribe button if you enjoy the content. And as always, keep watching.